What's going on? This is Ryan with Automatic Comics, and up next we are going to talk about the top 10 sales I saw last week. Stay tuned. Alright, so before we get started, please remember to hit that like button and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. Again, I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun talking with people in the comments and everything, so yeah, just really appreciate all the likes and the subscriptions and the comments. Now, this week I'm going to do my top 10 video a little bit differently, and that's because there was a different auction that ended this week. So this week I'm going to do the top 10 sales on the ComicLink auction. And so ComicLink had a featured auction that ended recently, and these sales totaled over $1 million for these 10 books. So I'm going to talk about these because these are some crazy high sales, some really fun books. And if you're not familiar with ComicLink, they are another auction house similar to Heritage, but they're a little more focused than Heritage. They don't have quite as many different types of things, that collectibles and that kind of thing that they sell. It's not just comics, despite their name. But they have two different types of auctions. They have featured auctions, which was this one, which tends to have much bigger books. It has larger books. It's like Heritage when they have their platinum or signature auctions. It's the same type of thing. And then they have what's called focused auctions, which tend to be more like the Heritage weekly auctions, where it's not those really massive $100,000+ books. They can still have big books in them, you know, books that are in the $10,000, $20,000 range, but they don't tend to get up into those really massive books. Now, I thought it would be fun this week to talk about these bigger books because that's where I'm still seeing a lot of strength in the comic market. In these big keys, in the Silver Age, Bronze Age, even into the Golden Age, there are just some really strong sales, and so I thought that would be an interesting area to talk about based on what I've seen in the comic market. Now, for the books I'm going to talk about, all of them sold for more than $50,000, and like I mentioned earlier, the total for these 10 books exceeded $1 million. So there are some big books in here. Now, one of the questions I often get, and part of the reason I also wanted to talk about ComicLink in this one, is that I often get a question about why I always talk about Heritage, why I always use Heritage. And the reason I like to use Heritage is because their auction happens weekly. And so I get very regular, consistent information, consistent data. Heritage also keeps their records forever, whereas ComicLink, they get rid of most of their records pretty quickly. Within a couple weeks, usually after an auction, you can't find that sales data anymore. So it's a real pain to deal with ComicLink sales data. Heritage also has really good pictures, and they take front and back pictures of all the books, whereas ComicLink doesn't do that. ComicLink, I know it's a common complaint with them that they often just have the front cover of the book, and so that's just something. It's nice when you're looking at books because you often, especially if you're dealing with lower grades, you want to know if there's maybe a big missing piece out of the back cover, that kind of thing. Now, like I've mentioned in my buying videos, just because I focus on Heritage in those other videos, that doesn't mean that I don't buy from other places. That's why I want to make it clear that there are plenty of other options out there, and ComicLink is one of them. They are actually probably, I guess, the second biggest comic generalized seller out there behind eBay. I would, even though they don't sell as regularly as Heritage sells weekly. ComicLink auctions are about once a month, maybe once every 6 weeks, something like that. But their auctions are so huge that they sell just way more books than Heritage does in each one of their individual auctions. That's one of the other reasons I prefer to use Heritage. Their auctions are manageable for me on a weekly basis if I want to follow all the keys that are in that auction, since Heritage has about 1,000 books, and I tend to pick out about 250 or so keys, and whereas ComicLink has auctions as big as 8,000 to 10,000 books, and it's overwhelming. Now, that is something I'll give some advice. If you want to follow ComicLink, you can find some great deals in there because there's so much volume that there are books that just tend to slip by at some pretty low prices. Like there was a 9/8 ASM 300 that sold for like $3,600 this week. So that's the type of thing where you can have some of those books really slip by, but that's also the intimidating part with it because it's tough. You can't really watch every single book. You can't price every single book, and so it's very easy to miss some of those really low sales. But so that's the thing. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You can have some lower sales like that, but also because tracking with ComicLink is so much harder, a lot of the price consolidation sites don't get all those ComicLink sales. So if you set a record in a ComicLink purchase, it may not end up in Go Collect, in GPA, that kind of thing. And so that can have a big impact on that fair market value if you attempt to sell the book again later. So I don't know why ComicLink doesn't keep their data forever like sites like Heritage do, and I believe Comic Connect does as well. It makes it easier for people like me to talk about these books, to effectively give them free advertising for their site. If they have record sales, it's better if people know about that. But for whatever reason, they don't keep it, and I think it's worse for them. I think it would be a good change for them to start retaining that data forever, but for whatever reason they don't, and it doesn't. I haven't heard anything that it seems like they're going to be changing that anytime soon. But if anybody from ComicLink watches my channel, that would be a recommendation I would make. Just retain your sales data indefinitely. All right, so with that, let's get into these sales, because there are some cool books, some big sales, and I know I said I was going to talk about 10 books, but I've got one honorable mention here. Really wanted to talk about this book, but there were 10 other books I also wanted to talk about, so I just added this one in. And so this is Amazing Spider-Man number 361, but this was a 9.9, and it sold for a record $52,000. Just a monster sale, just a ridiculous sale. And so this is the first appearance of Carnage, and so I think most of us know that that character is showing up in a movie. That movie has actually been delayed, and then I've heard rumors that they're going to be bringing it back and not delay it, but they don't really seem to know what they're doing with that movie right now. But a 9.8 of this book recently has been selling between $800 and $1,000. There are 4,557 9.8s on the census. For the 9.9s, there are only 4. 3 blue labels, and there's 1 signed copy. Now, normally when I see a 9.9 sell, it usually goes for a premium of about 10 times as much as the 9.8. So this sale was really, really shocking for a 9.9. I mean, this was about 50 times what this book has been selling for. So just a really, really extreme number. And so there was a 9.9 sale back in November of 2017. I can see it on Go Collect, but when you click on the link, it was a ComicLink sale. You can't see the actual sale. You can't get the number. This is part of the problem with ComicLink not retaining that data. So I have no idea what that 2017 sale was. However, there was a sale in 2019 of a 9.9, also not on Go Collect, but I found a video that Gem Mint did about it, because I think it was one of his friends that owned that book, and it was a 6-cover copy. So you know how you can have books that have like 2 covers, like a double cover? This one actually had 6 covers, and one of the covers was graded at a 9.9. And so this book got a 9.9, so it's a 9.9 6-cover copy, and this one sold in 2019 for $6,800. So this book sold about 2 years later for about 8 times as much, like $52,000. This one is not a double cover or multi-cover. This is just 1 cover at a 9.9. So, I mean, man, that's crazy, because like back then when that book sold for $6,800, a 9.8 was going for about $350 to $400. So that gives you that 10x plus a little bit more, because it's just a crazy multi-cover book. So it's about 15 times as much. Whereas this one, like I said, 50 times as much as the recent 9.8 sales. But that just goes to show you how if you get the right people in an auction, if there's a couple people with enough money and they both want that book, those prices can just keep going and going until somebody finally gives in. Right, now number 10. This is Captain America Comics number 1 with a CGC 5.5 conserved for $63,000. Now, this is one of the most iconic books from the Golden Age. This is the first appearance of Captain America, the first appearance of Bucky. He's on the cover punching Hitler in the face. Also, the important thing with this one is that this is before the U.S. joined World War II. So that is always pointed out, that that's one of the things that makes this so important and iconic, is that he's on the cover punching Hitler before the U.S. actually joined the war. Now, like I said, this is a conserved copy. So if you're not familiar with conserved, you can see it actually almost looks like a blue label. That's one of the things I don't like about the conserved copies, is I think they tend to trick a lot of people if you don't really know and you don't catch that it's actually a slightly different color than the blue labels, because a conserved copy is just a nice way of saying restored. It is still a restored book. It's just that it falls under a very specific category of restored. It has to be a type of A1 or 1A, which means it's a professional restoration, and there's a minimal, very small amount of restoration. That's what the A stands for, professional. The 1 means the smallest amount of restoration. Now, it's not just that. it also has to be very specific types of restoration. So it can't be things that add to the book. There's very specific types of restoration that are included. It's things like replacing staples, staple cleaning, cover reinforcement, but you can't do added pieces. And that's why I actually thought this one was very strange, because when you look at the details of this, it actually says that the book has a married cover and first wrap. What that means is that the cover and first wrap are not from this book. The cover and first wrap are from a different book. And so, in my mind, that means that you did add pieces. You added an entire cover. You added an entire first wrap. I don't see how this is qualified as a conserved book. I don't think it should be. I think that's actually an incorrect grading based on CGC's own site. Based on their own site, they specifically say no pieces added, and if you're adding an entire cover, that is one gigantic piece that you are adding to that book. But that's just my thoughts on it. I feel like that should have either been a purple label or a green label with restoration marked on it as well, because typically when you have married books, they often get green labels. They're qualified. But regardless, for this book, there are 181 copies on the census, 88 blue labels, and 84 restored. This one falls under that restored category. The last 5.5 blue label universal copy sold for $156,000 in 2019. The last sale for a 7.5 restored, so that was the last restored copy that sold, was in April for $50,000. The last conserved copy was a 7.5 that sold in 2019 for $96,000. And so that's one of the tough things with a book like this. You're not going to find the same grades selling very often. That's why I'm looking at different grades that just sold more recently. So this seems more or less in line with those books. However, I still don't think this should have qualified for that conserved label. All right, now number 9. This is Silver Surfer number 4 with a CGC 9.8 selling for $67,000. Now this wasn't a record, but this is one of the most iconic Silver Surfer covers out there. I'd say it's one of the most iconic covers out there, period, especially from the Silver Age. Just an extremely popular depiction of Thor battling Silver Surfer. And the cool thing about this book is it's basically popular for the cover. It's really a cover buy, and it commands a lot of money for that cover. Now, a 9.8 actually sold for quite a bit more than this back on June 19th. There was a $90,000 sale for a 9.8. Now, that 9.8 was white pages. This one was off-white to white. But man, $23,000 is a pretty big difference for page quality. So I think that it's one of these cases where there are only so many people that are willing to spend that amount of money on this book. One of those people got that book. And so there's less people willing to bid at that level for this book now, and the next person just happened to get it cheaper. Now, the fact of the matter is, this book is still up a lot. Last year, a 9.8 sold for $17,900, so even at this reduced price, it's up almost 300%. So just that book is up a lot, even at this lower price, even though it wasn't a record. Now, it's also a square-bound book, so it can be a little harder to get in high grade, but it is a late Silver Age book. This is a book from 1969, so there are actually quite a few 9.8s out there. There are 3,362 blue label copies, universal copies, and 24 of those are 9.8s. So it's not like it's extremely rare in 9.8. There's not just a couple. There are 24 of them. But expensive book regardless, but it has pulled back in the lower grades recently, and you could say it pulled back in this grade too. A 5.0 sold for $780 just last week, and that had peaked at about $1,200 in April. So still up from where it was a year ago, but this book has been pulling back. All right, now number 8, I'm gonna get some DC for this one, and this is Action Comics number 252 with a CGC 9.2 that sold for a record $80,000. Now, this is the first appearance of Supergirl, and surprisingly enough, this 9.2 is the highest graded copy. There are 4 total copies graded in a 9.2, and this is one of those 4, and that's pretty surprising because this is a Silver Age book. This is from 1959, and the fact that there isn't anything above a 9.2, not even a 9.4 or 9.6, let alone a 9.8, I think that's pretty crazy, especially for a book that's this popular where you think people are generally going to get that book graded if they have it. Now, the last sale for this book in a 9.2 was way back in 2015, and that was for $45,410. So it's a pretty big jump since then, about 80% in the last 6 years. A lot of that is probably from the increased popularity of that character recently. She's got a TV show now, all that kind of stuff. So anytime you get more publicity for a character, it does have a direct impact on the price of their comics. Now, I do imagine that there's some concern when someone's buying this book in that 9.2 because generally the highest graded copy on the census commands a premium. But when that highest grade is a 9.2 for a Silver Age book, the likelihood of a 9.4, 9.6, 9.8 existing raw out there in somebody's collection is actually pretty high. And so I'd say it wouldn't be a surprise to me if sometime in the next 5 years another copy gets graded that's higher than any of these. And that's going to have a very significant impact on the value of that 9.2. Generally, that means that 9.2 is actually going to drop in value quite a bit because it's no longer getting that premium for being the highest graded copy. Regardless, it is an awesome DC key. It's a great book. She's on the cover, and so I think it's a cool book to own. I would personally love to own a copy of that book someday, but I have never actually had a copy of that myself. All right, now number 7, and this was a book I had been waiting for a sale of this book for like 6 months. This is Incredible Hulk number 181 in a CGC 9.8 that sold for $86,000. This is a record in this grade, and pretty sure everybody knows what this book is since it's one of the most popular books of all time, and it's the first appearance of Wolverine. Well, it's the first full appearance of Wolverine. First time you see him is in Hulk 180, but this is a book that we actually hadn't seen a 9.8 sell for quite a while. The last one was back in March, where there was a $45,500 sale. The high had actually been $59,500 on February 16th, but I had really wanted to see one sell since the price of comics had spiked. I was wondering where it would end up because we had had a bunch of giant size X-Men 1 9.8 sell, but we hadn't had another Hulk 181, at least that I had seen on the public market. Now, if this book had sold back in May, I bet it would have broken $100,000. I think the fact that prices have retreated some, because I've definitely seen that in prices of Hulk 181, I think the fact that prices have retreated, that's what we got with this book too. I think it definitely would have broken $100,000 back in May or maybe early June. Now, I believe there is another one coming up in 9.8 in the Heritage Signature Auction, so we'll have to see what that one ends up selling for. Now, there are a lot of these books out there. I mean, like I said, it's one of the most in-demand books on the planet, and so they're a lot graded. The total census is 14,692 with 11,631 blue labels, and there are a lot of raw copies out there. There are a lot of people that actually hoard raw copies of this book. So if you've watched Golden Age Guru, he's talked about that, how he at one point was trying to get a short box of Hulk 181s. So I don't know exactly how many he has, but I think he has quite a few of them. Now, there are actually also quite a few in 9.8. There are 129 copies in a 9.8, but there is one single 9.9. Now, the question is, would it sell for 50 times what a 9.8 does? Because if it did, that would make it likely the most expensive book on the planet, because the most expensive book so far that has sold was that Action 1 and an 8.5 that sold for $3.25 million. But the 9.6 Amazing Fantasy 15 that's coming up in this next week in the Heritage Signature Auction, it's getting close. It may top that $3.25 million sale. It'll be really interesting to see. But I think this 9.9 Hulk 181 could be another contender for that, because with a book that's this popular, that's in this much demand, the fact that there's only one single 9.9 means that whoever owns that owns the best copy of that book in existence. And whenever there's multiple 9.8s, that kind of thing, you can never really say that. But with this book, you can say that. Now, the one big problem with this 9.9 is it was one of the earliest books graded by CGC. So it's got the really, really old label. And so I can't imagine anybody ever risking taking that book out. Getting that book re-slabbed, because if CGC takes it out and they say, we don't think that's a 9.9 anymore, we think that's a 9.8, you now lost millions of dollars, you know? I mean, minimum about $1 million probably, if not multiple millions of dollars. So I can't imagine taking that risk unless you got some type of specialized insurance to cover you for that re-slabbing being done. Right, now number 6, we're going to the Golden Age again, and this is Submariner #1 with a CGC 8.0 that sold for $90,000. Now, this isn't the first appearance of Submariner. That occurs at least in comics in Marvel Comics #1, but this is his first self-titled issue from the Golden Age. It's also an Alex Schomburg cover and a World War II cover where he's beating up Nazis, and so those books are always in high demand. They command a significant premium. And one thing I think that's also kind of interesting to point out is that people like to point out that Captain America was punching Hitler in the face, beating up Nazis before we joined the war, but Submariner was doing it even earlier. This book was actually after that, but Submariner was in other books prior to Captain America coming out where he's fighting Nazis. So he was also beating them up well before we joined the war. Now, the other thing that makes this book special is that this is a pedigree book. You can see it's got the tuxedo label. It doesn't have that golden label like you'll see with the Promise Collection books. That's just that they've changed what their pedigree labels look like, and so if this one got re-slabbed, then it would get that new pedigree label. But this pedigree is called the Eldon pedigree. And kind of the interesting thing about this one, as you can see, I'll try to zoom in on it if I can, Eldon is written on the cover. And so there are a bunch of these books out there. They don't actually know the size of the collection because the pedigree was given afterward. So the person who owned the collection, his name was Eldon Hammond, or Hammond, Hamman, and he passed away in 1987, well before any of these pedigrees were being established, and those books were sold off at that point. But people have been coming across them where you have this name Eldon written on the cover in pen, and so they now they give them this pedigree. So I think that's just one other little fun thing about this book. Now, it's a relatively rare book. I mean, Submariner 1, pretty rare. There are 131 total copies on the census with 70 blue labels. And this isn't the highest grade, but it is up there. There are 9 copies graded higher, including 2 and a 9.2. But out of those 70 copies, this one would be like the 61st highest graded copy. Now, this sale at $90,000 actually set the record for this book. This is now the highest selling price for this book, even though there are books graded higher. The prior record was $84,000 for a 9.0 back in 2019. And an 8.0 last sold for $55,333 back in August of 2020. So this was a big jump from that, and also, like I said, setting the record for this book. All right, now number 5. It's actually a signed book. This is X-Men #1 with a CGC 8.5 signed by Stan Lee. First book to hit that $100,000 mark on this list. This one sold for exactly $100,000. Now, this is the first appearance of the X-Men, the first appearance of Magneto, but this is actually a pretty big drop for the price of this book. But if you've watched my prior market videos, this really won't be that big of a surprise. We've been seeing drops in a lot of the X-Men keys, especially the ones that had jumped a lot early, like X-Men #1. Now, they are still way up from where they were a year ago, but they've dropped from their peaks. Now, the other interesting thing about X-Men #1 is for the big Silver Age keys, there are way more copies of this graded than any other one of those keys. There are 5,375 total copies on the census, with 3,867 being blue labels and 630 being signed. Now, of signed books, only 4 are graded higher than this one, and they're just a half a grade higher at a 9.0. Now, the reason I say the price of this book has dropped is that there had been an 8.0 blue label copy that sold on June 21st for $147,000. Now, an 8.5 last sold for $78,000 on April 4th, so you could say it set the record within the grade, even though it's signed, so you can't really do an exact comparison, but set the record within the grade, but a drop because that lower grade book, the 8.0, actually sold for more a couple months ago. So, but that's not outside the realm of what I've seen with drops in this book. I mean, that's a drop of about 30% or so, and I've been seeing that with this book, but it had been up 250%, so dropping 30% isn't really all that big of a deal, even though it seems like a ton of money. So for perspective, an 8.5 in March of last year, in March of 2020, sold for $35,000. In December of last year, sold for $51,000. So it's about 200% up from that $35,000 sale and 100% up from that $51,000 sale. So, I mean, again, even if it's dropped, it is still up a lot. Now, this is also one of those things that it's tough with signature series because a lot of times they do sell for more, but when you're talking about a book that is this expensive, so you've got a book that someone's spending 6 figures on, they're spending $100,000 on, you're already at a pretty small group of people that are willing to pay that amount of money for a comic. Now, add in a signature, and there are people that won't ever want to buy a signature book, especially when you've got a high-grade Silver Age key like this. They'll see that as damage. And so for them, you're now losing other buyers. And so you may have a pretty small pool of buyers, and so that could also have impacted the price of this book. All right, now number 4, we're going back to DC again, and this is Superman #1 with a CBCS 1.5, selling for $116,000. Now, this is one of the most iconic books of the Golden Age. I mean, just an incredible cover. It's one of the best Superman covers. It is a great cover from the Golden Age. And this book, as well as a lot of those other Golden Age Superman big books, are always going to be in demand, regardless of what anybody thinks about modern Superman's depiction or that character. This being the first superhero, I mean, this book is just going to be iconic, just like Action Comics #1, Detective Comics 27, Batman #1. These books are just, they're so important in the history of comics that they just transcend anything where it's the popularity of that character in some recent movie or something like that. Now, this is a pretty rare book. There are 176 copies on the CGC census. Now, this is a CBCS book, but there's 176 copies on the CGC census, with 78 being universal copies. Now, this was actually kind of a disappointing sale for this book because a 1.0 CGC sold on May 27th for $155,000, so about $40,000 more for a half grade lower. Now, it was a very nice looking book, and that is very important when you're talking about low grade copies. It had a split spine and a coupon cutout, and so it had a 1.0, but the last 1.5 sold for $90,000 in March of 2020. And there was a high sale of a 1.5 of $120,777 back in 2019. So this didn't even set the record. And given the price moves we've seen in a lot of books, it's a little surprising. Now, one reason I think that may be the case is that, and I know it's surprising to people, especially when you're talking about big books like this, but I think it was probably because it was a CBCS labeled book. Even for really big monster books, you will often see reduced prices paid for CBCS. And part of that is that if, say, somebody wanted to get this regraded, say they wanted it in a CGC case, they might be afraid if they send this to CGC, they're going to get a 1.0. And if they get that 1.0, then they are now spending a bunch of money. It'll cost them $3,000 to $5,000 to get that book graded. And then they're getting a lower grade book, so they're afraid to pay that full $150,000 or whatever it is for that book. Now, that is not an unfounded fear or concern in my opinion. I have noticed that on the lower end, CBCS grades a lot more friendly than CGC. I actually agree more with how CBCS grades the lower grade books, and whether you agree with me or not, I have plenty of examples where you can see this, that they definitely grade. CGC grades more harshly than CBCS on the low grades. And if you ever watch Dave from Comic Book Investments, he actually did a video about this recently, that it's the same thing that he's seen, where CBCS grades easier on the lower grades than CGC. And because of that, somebody's likely going to be less willing to pay as much money for that CBCS book in that low grade, because they are concerned if they get it regraded at CGC, it's going to come back lower. All right, now number 3, this is Journey into Mystery, number 83, with a CGC 9.0 that sold for $118,003. Now, this is the first appearance of Thor. This is also a white pages copy. And so when you're talking about page quality, I know I've said generally I don't put much into page quality. I don't care about page quality. But that can have a potential impact on the price of that book. Now, this is a big sale for this book. The prior record in this grade was $87,000 in April of this year. So that's up about $30,000 in just 4 or 5 months. And so that's actually a trend that I've seen, where even though we've been seeing the prices of a lot of books decline recently, big Silver Age keys, for the most part, I've been seeing go up. And so especially when you're talking about high grade copies. And part of that is the person who's spending $100,000 is very different from the person who's spending $2,000 or $10,000 on a book. It's somebody who is in a very different financial position normally, and isn't going to be somebody that's impacted by maybe a lot of the other things that are going to impact somebody that's purchasing a book at the lower price ranges, $1,000 to $10,000. So I think it's if you aren't buying books that cost that much, it might be difficult to put yourself in the position of somebody that's buying a book that costs that much. But I have been seeing really strong sales with those types of books. I've been seeing those books continue to set records. Now, for the big Silver Age keys, unlike X-Men #1, there are actually quite a few less copies of this book out there. There are only 2,102 total graded copies, with 1,549 universal copies. So that's less than half of what you have for X-Men #1. Now, in a 9.0, there are 18 copies out there. There are only 20 copies graded higher, including a single copy at a 9.6. And Thor has actually gotten quite a bit more popular over the last few years, and I honestly think a big part of that is Thor Ragnarok. I think that had a big impact on his public perception. I think it really changed how people look at that character, instead of kind of being like a stuffy god that always speaks in proper old English, to being kind of like a relatable, fun hero. And so I think that definitely has had an impact on the prices of this book. All right, now number 2. So this one, another big Silver Age key. This is Tales of Suspense, number 39, in a CGC 9.0 that sold for $145,000. And we're getting into some really rare air up here with these $100,000 plus sales. This one around $150,000. First appearance of Iron Man, and this is actually one of my favorite Silver Age key, like the big key covers. I really like how the blue pops on that cover against that greenish gray background. I think it looks just incredible. I also really like that the suit on there is the original one that Iron Man built when he had been captured in the movie. I just think that makes it really a cool book. Now, this book also has a lot less copies than X-Men #1, but there are more of them than Journey into Mystery 83. There are a total of 2,428 copies on the census, with 1,798 being blue labels. There are 18 in a 9.0 and 42 graded higher, with the highest graded copy being a 9.8. So there is a 9.8, a single 9.8 out there. Now, this was another massive sale for this book. The prior high for this grade was $52,800 in February of 2019. The last sale was $46,800 in July of 2020. So this book has tripled in about the last year. So it's up around 200%, just a monster sale. Now, an 8.0 did sell for $75,000 on eBay in July, so it's not surprising that we saw a jump in this book, but almost double what that 8.0 sale was for a 9.0. I mean, that is a really, really strong sale. So this goes with what I was saying. With these high-grade Silver Age keys, we are continuing to see strong sales. Now, the other thing to note with this book is that if you look in the upper left corner, whatever it would be, of the slab, this one has a sticker on it that says CVA. And what that CVA sticker indicates is that this book presents exceptionally well for the grade. So it is a really good-looking 9.0. And when somebody's spending $145,000 on a book, you want a book to look as good as possible. So that type of sticker, that type of additional acknowledgement about the book can have an impact on the price of that book. Now, honestly, I'm a little surprised that we've continued to see so much strength in Tales of Suspense number 39, just because Iron Man died in the MCU, but he really established himself as such a cultural icon because of the role that character has played over the last 10 years, that I guess it's not too surprising that there's continued demand for it. Still, a little bit surprising for me, given that we really probably aren't going to be seeing much of that character, if any, in the future. All right, so number 1, this was the biggest sale of the ComicLink auction. This was a Daredevil number 1 in a CGC 9.6 that sold for $151,000, the only book that broke that $150,000 mark. Now, his first appearance of Daredevil, he's still wearing his old yellow costume that he wore for the first 6 issues. You can also see him in Amazing Spider-Man 16, crossed over, wearing that yellow costume as well. Now, this book, you can see, also has one of those CVA stickers on it. So again, I mean, it's already a 9.6, so I don't know how it presents exceptionally well for a 9.6, but I guess it presents well for a 9.6. Now, this one also had white pages, so that's another plus for this book. Now, it just barely beat the prior record. The prior record was $150,000, and that was set back in April. So this one beat that record by just $1,000. Now, that may not sound like much, but I'd been seeing the prices of Daredevil 1 drop quite a bit, similar to X-Men 1 recently. And that's because it was another one of those books that moved pretty early, moved around the time of X-Men 1, and so it had been declining. So having another sale that hits that record is very significant in my mind for this book. It means that there's just that continued high demand, continued big sales for these key issues. Now, I don't normally compare this book to a book like X-Men 1. I don't think it's quite in the same level as that level of key, but for comparison on the census, there are slightly less copies graded. There are 5,235 total copies, but there are slightly more universal copies. There are 4,160 universal copies on the CGC census. Now, there are actually 29 9.6s, so there are a lot of copies of this book in a 9.6. I mean, that's a significant number for a relatively early Silver Age key. There are even 2 in 9.8, so there are 2 books that are actually graded higher than this, so no telling what those would sell for, given the 9.6 is selling for $151,000. But Daredevil has really had a lot of heat on that character. The prices have gone up a lot over the last about 6 months, ever since rumors started to come out, and then I believe were actually confirmed that Daredevil is going to be in the next Spider-Man movie. We haven't seen him in the trailers. There were some people who thought maybe they saw him in one of the trailers, but nothing confirmed about him being in the trailers. But he is expected to be in that movie, and so a lot of people have been then speculating that he's now in the MCU. They're going to bring back a show maybe to Disney Plus, something like that, and so that's been driving up the prices of those books. Now, if you want to see a bunch of copies of this book, recommend checking out Raleigh Comic Book Collector on IG. He loves this book. He hoards this book like other people might hoard like copies of the 1990s X-Men 1. He has 18 copies at least. I've seen one picture on Instagram where he had 18 copies of them laid out on a table. It just incredible. So if you want to go see just one of the most ridiculous, just impressive Daredevil 1 collections, he might have the most of them. I don't know if there's someone out there that has more, but he has a lot of them. It's pretty cool, so I recommend checking out his IG. All right, so those are the top 10, and then I've got the 11 books that I wanted to talk about. Total for all 11 books was $1,068,003. So just incredible for 11 books hitting that kind of average, averaging just under $100,000 per book. So really impressive. It's just one of those things. I think it's always fun getting to look at some of these rare books that are out there, getting to see what they sell for, what kind of market there is out for them, just because they aren't books that I ever really see myself being able to own. So cool being able to just see them, knowing that they exist and that they're out there. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. I've got more videos over here if you'd like to watch some of my other videos, and the subscription button right here if you'd like to subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video.